Hello, I'm Mr. Beasley, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. This is a poem about a Japanese aircraft pilot in World War II. And kamikaze pilots were expected to fly a plane loaded heavily with explosives into an attack with American warships. They would attack with traditional machine gun fire before flying directly into the boat as a final suicidal act of precise, targeted destruction. The word kamikaze comes from the Japanese word kami, meaning divine, and kaze, meaning wind, and was first used to describe the two typhoons that, according to Japanese tradition, destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet led by Kublai Khan in the year 1281. It's written in the form of a narrative poem in which we hear two voices telling the story. The first is the poet narrator, who appears to be listening, interpreting, and then retelling the events from the daughter of the pilot, and this is the second voice that we hear. The poet distinguishes one voice from the other through the use of italics, which begin to appear just over halfway through the poem. The narrative that is pieced together from these two voices tells how the pilot set out one morning, ready to fight the enemy in a kamikaze attack, but then changes his mind and turns back. The main interest in the poem lies in the efforts of the narrator and the pilot's daughter to understand what must have happened in the pilot's mind that morning to make him turn the plane around, and also, of course, the treatment by his family and whole community as a result of that decision. It's difficult to know for certain why pilots volunteered for kamikaze missions because of the propaganda of the time. Some sources suggest that there were far more volunteers for this service than available planes, and that those who died did so in a state of bliss, confident that their sacrifice would bring honour to themselves and demonstrate the love they had for their families and the emperor, while other sources paint a bleaker picture of pilots barely able to stand for shaking and being manhandled onto the planes. What is certainly true is that this idea of honour is hugely important in the poem and stems from the much older tradition of the samurai who preferred death to defeat. A further reason may have stemmed from something called the Imperial Rescript on Education, which students had to memorise and recite at important school ceremonies, and part of this script pledged an oath to offer themselves courageously to the state, as well as protect the imperial family. The ultimate offering was to give up one's life. In other words, it was an honour to die for Japan and the emperor. And one way of looking at this oath, of course, is as a type of brainwashing, and this is important for details in Stanza One, which I'll come to in just a minute. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes, like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat. Safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna. A dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my father never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, and that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. The first stanza here contains several images of the pilot's readiness for the mission he's about to undertake. The word embarked rather makes it sound as though he's going on a trip or an adventure, while the image of sunrise might remind us of the affectionate nickname for Japan, which is the land of the rising sun. And so this image creates a feeling and tone of patriotism. The pilot shows his adherence to the samurai code most obviously by the sword he has in the cockpit with him, but also by shaving his head and having no substance except a flask of water, both of which are symbolic of a pure and simple life. The powerful incantations may suggest the ritual oath which school children regularly recited, pledging to give up their lives for the emperor, while the one-way journey into history clearly has a sense of heroism, bravery and honour about it. I always think it's useful to look out for changes in tone in poetry, and the word but here, which is used at the start of stanza 2, is a real signpost that the mood is about to change. It's also important to notice that here we have the first mention of another person, the daughter of the pilot, who years after the events being described here tells the story of what happened to her father. And this narrative aside is given to us in an embedded clause, blocked off from the rest of the line using these commas. And this added-in detail gives us another layer of meaning to think about with this poem, because whatever events are being recounted here have had a far-reaching impact across several generations. The modal verb must, which is used in this line, is really interesting. Remember that this is about a kamikaze pilot who fails to go through with his mission, returns home, and is rejected by his family. The word must begins to try and explain what must have happened in the cockpit that morning and what must have been going through the pilot's mind in order to make him turn back. But no one actually knows. The word doesn't convey any certainty. The daughter doesn't know because she would never have asked him, and so all that follows the beginning of this account is conjecture, supposition and guesswork. Surely this is what must have happened, but no one actually knows. What the daughter supposes is that her father looked down at the fishing boats on the water as he flew over the coastline. There's a simile used here to compare the little fishing boats to bunting, and bunting is usually used for celebrations. And in this poem, it is the ocean and the power of nature in general which is celebrated over the destructive power of war. The speaker imagines the pilot looking down at these boats on a beautiful green-blue translucent sea. And the word translucent is interesting as well, as it means seeing through something. Perhaps the poet-narrator imagines that in this moment the pilot is seeing through those powerful incantations from stanza 1. And beneath them are shoals of fish arcing in swathes, like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other. And this simile perhaps helps us to imagine the huge numbers of fish in the ocean, which the narrator imagines appearing to signal to the pilot as he flies overhead, perhaps waving goodbye to him. The dark shoals, along with their flashing silver bodies, create a contrast of images which both reflect the mystery and beauty, even wealth, within the ocean. And these images trigger off memories of the pilot's childhood, how he and his brother had been on the shore building these cairns, which are these piles of stones, to see which of them would last the longest against the incoming tide. And this is a game they played while waiting for their father's fishing boat to return home safely. The idea of boats and coming home safely are two recurrent images in this poem. Obviously there's the fishing boat, which I've just mentioned, but there's also the pilot who makes the choice to come home safely rather than commit suicide by flying into an American warship. And then there's the warship itself, which is never mentioned directly, but its presence is implied by the actions of the pilot. And perhaps one of the things which makes the pilot return from his kamikaze mission is the image of all the children of American soldiers waiting for their father's boat to come home safely. But as a reader, our certainty about this detail is as flimsy as the narrator's. What is interesting is that the poet chooses this moment to bring in the voice of the pilot's daughter for the first time, who seems to back up or support this version of events. Clearly the detail of grandfather's boat is an important one. The italicised clause appears almost as an interruption to the narrator's account, which, you might have noticed, hasn't been broken yet by a single full stop. And this is a poetic technique called enjambment, which is where one line of poetry extends into the next without a piece of punctuation to slow it down. Here, it's used to represent the flow of memory which pours out unbroken from the voice of the daughter and interrupted by the narrator. The interruption causes the word safe to be repeated as the narrator picks up where she left off and continues to describe the riches that the pilot's father found in the ocean. And the one which really stands out, of course, is the description of the tuna, which is compared metaphorically to the dark prince of the ocean. And this fits in with a pattern of images in the poem which highlight where real mystery, majesty and value exist, not in some meaningless suicide mission, but in the wealth and beauty of nature. In the stanza which follows, we hear the voice of the daughter for a much more sustained period, and the narrative that she picks up will last for much of the remainder of the poem. And this is where we begin to understand the impact of the Kamikaze pilot's decision not to go through with his mission, and just how important these joint ideas of shame and honour are in Japanese culture. The pilot's wife never spoke again in his presence or even looked him in the eyes. Such was the shame she felt he had brought to their family. And the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. So the sense of dishonour extends beyond the family into the community as a whole, until it's only the pilot's children, including the speaker, who still carry on as normal. But even this is short-lived, and soon they too learn of the shameful act of their father in not giving his life to his country and the emperor, perhaps through the same ritual chanting of the imperial rescript that I mentioned at the beginning. Certainly the word learned suggests that this was part of their education. The reality of this must have been devastating, as the pilot's own children behave as if he'd never returned and that he was no longer the father they loved. In the final two lines, the narrative switches back to the poet-narrator, who finishes the process of listening, translating from the pilot's daughter by saying that sometimes he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. And I'm going to draw your attention once more to the modal verb here, must, which again reminds us that this, along with what has happened in the mind of the pilot as he flew over the coastline, is all supposition and guesswork. No one, not even the pilot's immediate family, know the answers to these questions because they never asked him. The shame was too much for them to ever speak to him again. The final two lines are also a clear indication of just how terrible the treatment of the pilot is. For the daughter to think that perhaps the sudden violent death of a kamikaze suicide mission might have been preferable to the drawn-out existence of a man shunned by his family and friends for the rest of his life.